when we think about the idea of the doctrine, or the doctrine of discovery, we think about the idea of rights. Because in essence, the doctrine of discovery is an instrument of giving rights to European nations to discover and to conquest, to possession. And it's also an instrument to diminish the rights of the indigenous people who are a victim of the discovery. And when we think about rights, we think about rights in terms of natural law. Rights arise out of law. When we think about natural law, those natural rights such as the right to life, liberty, inalienable rights. And we also think about law, legal rights, those rights that are derived from law, arising out of societal norms and customs. And some examples of that would be the right to vote or the right to bear arms. And typically what we see is that natural rights form the basis of legal rights. Now, under a medieval Christian theory of rights, rights come from the Christian God, and rights arise out of Christian normative values. So the Pope is God's chosen leader, and he's charged with the spiritual well-being of all people. And the Pope has the authority to enforce natural law and to punish divergences from the law, which are essentially Christian normative values. So if you diverge from the way we see things, we can, in essence, conquer you. And we have justification for it. And our justification is based in law. It's our legal right to do so. In 1250, Pope Innocent IV stated that the Pope has jurisdiction over all men and power over them in law. And if the infidels do not obey, then war may be declared against them. And we see the doctrine of discovery arising out of the Crusades. And during the Crusades, the Pope would issue these legal bulls, which were essentially legal edicts, declaring that Christian kings and princes had the authority to raise armies and attempt to retake what is known as the Holy Lands. And in exchange for taking on these missions, if they were successful, they would then get exclusive trading rights. They would get rights over the natural resources. There was also a caveat that they were to convert they were responsible for the conversion of the infidels. But really what we see, throughout history is it's not about conversion, and it's not a missionary practice. It's about control of natural resources, control of wealth, and control of human capital. In the 1400s, as the European nations began to look outside of Europe and begin to set their sights on Africa and eventually on the Americas, what we see are conflicts between the nations, particularly Spain and Portugal, for trading routes and rights to portions of land. And at this time, Portugal had laid claim to the west coast of Africa. And they came back to the Pope and requested that the Pope issue a bull declaring that they had the legal right to this land and to prohibit other European nations from interfering with that right. And the Pope issues a bull in 1452 which gives Portugal the exclusive rights to this land and prohibits the interference by other European nations with their right. And in part the bull provides that King Alfonso is given the right to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all enemies of Christ, wheresoever placed, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever held and possessed by them, and to reduce them to perpetual slavery. So what we see is a decree by the Pope providing that not only do you control now the natural resources, you also control the people, and they have been reduced to perpetual slavery, and no other European nation can interfere with that right. As a result of the Pope's decree, the Papal Bull, Spain in particular is locked out of this West Africa area, and they're looking for other trading routes, particularly for the spice trade and in search of gold and other resources. And as we all know, Columbus gets this bright idea that he has a shorter route to India, and he sets off sail eventually after convincing Spain that to fund his mission. And of course, Columbus gets lost, and eventually he's discovered by the Arawaks of the Caribbean on their shores. And what we see in this case is a similar replication of what happened with the Portugal in West Africa, is that based upon the divergence from Christian normative values, the indigenous people could be subjugated. Their property, their resources could be possessed by Spain. And Pope Alexander VI issues a papal bull granting Columbus's discoveries to Spain, and in part providing that Spain was to subdue the land and the inhabitants and to spread the Catholic faith. The caveat being that the land could not have been controlled in the past by another Christian nation. So if Spain is the first Christian nation, Spain has control. And that's the underlying principle of the Doctrine of Discovery, is that if another European nation does not have control, then the European nation which discovers gets control. Now, as we know, the England breaks with the Catholic Church during Reformation. And while they've broken from the Pope's authority, they still have to deal with the armies of Spain and Portugal. So they can't necessarily say, well, we don't believe that the Pope has authority now, so we can come into West Africa and declare our rights here, because they'd have to face the armies of Portugal. And the same with Spain. So what the country of England begins to do is look towards other unexplored areas, and that includes North America. Now, under Queen Elizabeth, she initially attempted to set up several permanent colonies in North America, but that failed. But in 1606, the Virginia Company, which was a joint stock company, was set up to establish colonies overseas. And the king provided in part that the company would hereinafter lend to the glory of his divine majesty in propagating Christian religion to such people, as yet live in darkness and miserable ignorance of the true knowledge and worship of God, and may in time bring infidels and savages living in those parts to human civility and to a settled and quiet government. So while not ascribing to the Pope's authority, England still ascribes to the right of discovery based upon European normative Christian values and the divergence from these values by the indigenous inhabitants.